columns, beams, and lumber in our class. We're going to go through some exercises on understanding how the software calculates the needs for different lengths of lumber, how to insert beams and members on different planes and structured areas of your plan as well. Following the presentation, we're going to open up the chat line. You can type in questions that you might have about columns, beams, and lumber. So at any time during the broadcast, please feel free to type in your questions. And once I've done the formal part of the presentation, I'll go to that part of the chat panel and I'll read out your questions. It's a great way to learn more. If you're thinking a question, chances are many people also are as well. So type in your questions and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Following the entire presentation, I'm going to email you out a booklet so you can read about columns, beams, and lumber and all of the settings that I talked about today and all of the different procedures so that you can read about it. And also in that email will be a link and a password for our archive so you can watch past presentations as well. So let's get started in today's class about columns, beams, and lumber. So looking at my screen today, I've got a very simple building drawn, 4 walls and a simple gable roof. But we're going to look at those walls and that roof and understand all of the settings behind it when it's creating all of the framing behind it. I'm going to go up to the View pull-down menu. I'm going to choose Framing, and I'm going to choose Display Framing. When I do that, all of the framing that's part of my drawing will appear. What we're going to talk about today is how it chose those different pieces of lumber, how we can customize what it's choosing, and how it knows what length of board to order every time it looks at that lumber list. First of all, looking at the walls themselves. When I look at the walls, I see that it's a 16 inches on center spacing and that there's no blocking up the wall. How did the walls know to frame themselves to that particular setting? I'm going to go back to View Framing and display all but the framing so we can get back looking at our wall. So how did that brick wall know what type of framing was set to it? Well, first of all, I'm going to left click to select one of the brick walls. And then I'm going to right click and look at the properties. So left clicking always selects something in our software, right clicking reveals the options. And the option I want to look at is the properties of that wall. So when we look at this wall, under the Basic tab, it's telling us that this is a framed wall. If it's not set to framed, the wall will not take any framing on. So if you have a wall that you think that should have framing in it, I've specified everything about it, if it's not set to framed, that wall will leave itself unframed. And that sometimes is a very handy feature, setting it to general instead of framed. For those of you that use our software for remodeling purposes, when you're drawing out and sketching the existing house, you don't want any framing because you don't want to count all of that framing. So set the existing house to general. It'll show the walls. You'll see them in your plan so that you can make your working drawings from them. But because it's set to general, you won't get any framing data from them. If it's set to framed, it's going to fully frame that wall and count every piece of lumber that's in that wall. When we set it to framed, it looks down to the bottom of this dialog box to see what the default size it should use for member every time it puts down a framing piece. So it's going to use a 2x4. If you wanted a 2x6, or if you were using a pole barn and wanted maybe a 4x4 or a 6x6 or whatever size, you choose this button right here, Framing Member. By clicking on that framing member, it'll take you back into our catalog so you can specify what size of member that you want to use. So I'm going to click on that Framing Member button and take us into the catalog to take a look. So in here, I'm going to grab the 2x4 that it was looking at, but you can see I can grab any size of member. What I specifically want to look at for this member are the properties behind it, because a 2x4 can come in many different lengths. And I want to make sure that it's going to be grabbing the right length for this purpose that I need it for my studs, for my top plate, for my bottom plate, for the sills. All of the different uses of this 2x4, I want to make sure that all of the lengths that I can order are sitting inside that 2x4. So I'm going to right-click on that 2x4 in the list, and we're going to edit that element, look at its properties. By editing that element, the first basic tab that you see is basically outlining the shape of the member that you can use, because a member in our software can have many different shapes set to it. You can even have a custom profile set to it. So our 2x4 obviously is just a solid rectangle, 3.5 inches by 1.5 inches, and those can be any sizes you want. So if you wanted nominal sizing, you can certainly punch that in. What we're interested in today is this second tab at the top, called Purchased Items. This looks at that 2x4, and it'll list down all of the lengths that it's available in that you could order. So there's a 92 5/8 pre-cut stud length. I can order an 8-footer, a 104 5/8, again another pre-cut stud length, and a 116 5/8, again another pre-cut, a 10-footer, a 12-footer, a 14-footer, and a 16-footer. So when it goes to start framing that wall, it knows it's using a 2x4, and specifically this one. And it knows it can order these various lengths. So whatever is the best length for the job, it will grab. So when it's looking at our 8-foot walls, it'll come through and say, I'm going to order a 92 5/8 pre-cut stud length. Now, what would stop it from using that stud length for other jobs, like your top plates or your bottom plates? We have rules that we set to each one of these lengths. Looking down here at the bottom of this dialog box, we see that there's a rule set here that says only used for these usages, stud. So if I'm going to be building a wall and it knows I need a top plate, it knows when it looks at this particular length, it can't use it. Don't use these for anything but studs. So it's going to bypass it and then go to the 8-foot length. And perhaps the 8-foot length has rules set to it. Never use these for top plates. And then my pre-cut studs will also have rules about only being used as a stud. So if you only want 16-foot boards for top plates, all of these other lengths in the list, you could set a rule for that. Either only use it for a stud or don't use it for anything. Don't use it for a top plate, as an example. So how do you set these rules in this list? Here's a list of all the lengths I can get, but how do I get the rules? Well, looking above these lengths, you can see you can add any number of lengths. You can hit Add, or you can edit any of the lengths that are already here in this list. So, for example, I'm looking at this 2x4 by 8, my 8-foot length. Looking down at its rule, it says don't use these for blocking and don't use these for plates. Well, I want to edit that. So I'm going to hit the Edit button. So now I'm very specifically looking at that 8-foot length. Here's where we can set up the rules. It knows the length is an 8-foot piece. Use this length for all usages. Use it for everything. I don't care. Set it for using it for studs if you have to. Use it for plates, whatever you need to use it for. Only these usages, and that's what we set those pre-cut studs lengths to. Only these usage, and then we add a usage. So I would say add the usage of stud. Or any usage. Use it for absolutely anything, but don't use it for blocking. Don't use it for plate. If I wanted to use it for blocking, I could delete that usage. But then if I went in later and said, oh, I want to add that back in, I'd hit Add Usage and say that I don't want to use it for something else in my list here. Won't use it for blocking, and click OK. So now that 8-foot piece can be used for absolutely anything in framing my wall, but never use it for blocking and never use it for plate. When you're tying this into a point-of-sale system, those of you that are working from a lumber yard or a building supply center, this part number here is what attaches it to your SKU number. So that's the exact SKU number that you have in your stores. Then I'm going to click OK. And now that we know that that 8-foot piece can't be used for blocking, can't be used for plate, and our studs can only be used for studs. So for every length that you want to be able to order, you put them in the list. And when they're in the list, when it's going and framing a wall or framing a floor or framing a roof, it looks through the board lengths that you've specified. So when you're using a 2x4 for that wall, it looks at this 2x4, looks at the lengths available, and optimally uses the lengths that it needs. If there's rules like we've put here, then it will bypass that board length to go to the next board length until it finds one that it can use without any rules set against using it. Okay? I'm going to hit OK there and OK. So our 2x4 clay brick wall is a framed wall, and it knows to use the 2x4 for its framing. That 2x4 knows the various lengths that it's available in, and it will use them to frame that wall. So now the next step is, well, how did it know I wanted 16 inches on center, and how many top plates and how many bottom plates? Well, I'm going to hit cancel out of here, and I'm going to take you up to the settings pull-down menu, and I'm going to look at building locations. Anytime you draw anything in our software, it always looks at this building locations dialog box. So when you start drawing walls, it looks up here to see the height of the wall and the distance from that wall off of grade. Once it has those values, then it looks at this next option here, the very last column, the framing options. The framing options set how the walls are going to be framed on that particular location. So every location has its separated framing options. So if you want to frame walls differently on the foundation wall, maybe use a pressure-treated bottom plate. And then on your ground floor, use a double bottom plate, double top plate. But then on your second floor, maybe only use a single bottom plate and a single top plate, or a double top plate. Whatever you want, you can set those framing options. All you do is pick on the framing options beside the location that you want to work with. So here we are looking at the framing information for my ground floor. This is where it's saying 16 inches on center, double plate. If you double click on one of those options, it'll bring up all the options that you have to choose from. So from there I could say, well, I want it to be double top and bottom plate. Or maybe I want it to be a double top plate and I want blocking halfway up the wall. So it knows I'm using a 2x4, and now it knows exactly how to use those 2x4s along the wall. Give me a double top plate, a single bottom plate, and a row of blocking halfway up. And it will use that for all of your walls throughout the project. I'm going to click OK and OK again. So now if I go back up to View, Framing, Display the Framing, you can see that we've got blocking, and I'm just going to put this in a rendered outline view. So this little button down at the bottom of the screen allows you to change your view type, and I'm going to put it into a rendered outline view so you can see the framing a little bit better. So we can see we have, if I zoom in even closer here, a single bottom plate. We've got a double top plate. So I'll just highlight these options here. There's our double top plate. There's our single bottom plate. And there's our row of blocking halfway through. The others are the floor joists that are underneath it for the floor framing. So it's following those rules that I set up to use that framing. When it comes along to these studs, it looks at the length and the height of the wall, an 8-foot wall, and says, I can use a 92 5/8 pre-cut stud. When it looks at my bottom plates and it looks at that 2x4, it goes through the list and says, oh, I can't use the 8-foot, I can't use the pre-cuts, maybe I can't use a 10-foot, I'm going to have to order this in 16-foot boards going across. And it'll tell me exactly how many 16-foot boards I need. So that's how it's ordering all of that lumber used for those walls. Now I'm going to go back here and put it back out of our framing, so display all but the framing. And I'm going to punch a hole in that wall. I'm going to put a window in right there. And then over here, I'm going to grab a door. So now I have a window and a door. I'm going to just zoom out a little bit so we can see those. I'm going to go back up to View, Framing, Display the Framing. Now we can see when we're looking at those openings that it's framed around those openings. I've got a jack and a king stud, and I've got a header above the window, and I've got a sill beneath with cripples. How did it know how to handle that opening and how I wanted to frame it? Well, again, while it's drawing that wall, and as you punch in those openings, it is constantly looking up at settings, building locations. On the framing options, again, I'm going to go back to that framing options column at the very end. We looked at how it's going to infill the wall to frame it, but we also at the very top of this dialog box have span tables. So anytime I punch a hole in the wall, it looks at these span tables. And these span tables have header sizes and framing styles associated to it, so it knows how to frame around those openings. So I'm going to double click on the load-bearing span table to bring up its options. You can have as many span tables set up as you need. So again, if you know that you're going to be framing openings differently on the ground floor versus the second floor, you can have 2 different span tables. Or if you do some pole barns, maybe have a specific span table set for pole barns. For our openings, I use this general 2-ply span table. So I'm going to double click on it to bring up the spans that are inside that table. This span table tells me that anything up to a 3-foot span, it's going to frame the opening with 2 2x8s. If the opening is larger than 3 foot, but less than 10 feet, it's going to use 2 2x10s. And then openings over 10 feet, but less than 16 feet, it's going to use some timber strand product. Over 16 feet, right up to 17 feet, it bumps that up to use the 11/7/8 product. If you want to customize any of these, so you wanted to bump that 17 feet up to 20 feet, and then pick a different product, you can go into the list and tell it the different product that you want to use for that particular opening. If you don't find how you'd like to frame it, notice the little button that appears over to the right. That little button right there allows you to go in and create a whole new configuration of how you want to frame your openings. So I'm going to click on that little button, and it takes me into the list of all of those different framing styles, 2 2x8s, 2 2x10s, 2 2x12s, the 11/7/8. If I right-click in there, it allows me to create a whole new method of framing an opening. So I'm going to say add a new head sill jamb configuration. At the top, I'm just going to type the word new today to say we're creating a new one. But you would very specifically call out the products that you're going to be using for framing it. So when you notice it in the list, you can see exactly what it's using, and it becomes very obvious which one you want to choose. On the left-hand side of this dialog box, it lists out the various members that you could use. In the middle, once you highlight one particular member, it'll show you the parameters that are set up for it. And then on the right-hand side, it will highlight that member that you're using in the member list. So you can see this green highlighted king stud in my preview here, and all of its settings in the middle. So basically what this is telling you, these settings in the middle, is that the king stud is going to use the exact same member that the wall properties told it to use. And today's wall properties said to use a 2x4. So when we're using the king stud, it's going to look at that 2x4 and use it for the king studs too, not just the studs, but the king studs. Use the member from the wall's properties. It told us to use a 2x4. If I wanted to rotate that member, so if I wanted it on the flat for whatever reason, I could rotate it, and it would rotate its orientation. This is where it's labeling it, so when it appears in the quantity list, it knows to label it as a stud in the group called wall framing. Now, as far as positioning that king stud, where does it know where to sit in our wall? It knows that it's always going to be attached to the jack stud. So if I put a jack stud in, right beside it, right up against it, is going to be my king stud, right to left. And it's going to have a 0-inch difference between the jack and the king. If I wanted to leave a gap for whatever reason, I could specify a distance there. Now, looking in a plan view of this wall, I'm going to view it as 2D. When it's looking at the studs and the king studs and the jacks, positioning front to back, so along the wall itself, we want it to be middle to middle of that wall. The midpoint of the stud is the midpoint of the bottom and the top plate. Run them all right center to center. We could shift that back or forth, so if for any reason we wanted to move it back or move it forward, we could do that, and that's positioning it front to back in that wall. We can also, just scrolling down to the bottom here, the top end and the bottom end. The top end, if I view that back as a 3D model, is going to attach itself to the top plate, and the bottom is going to anchor itself to the bottom plate. So you can see where the other pieces would change that up. So when I'm looking at the jack stud, I'm just going to click on that jack stud and scroll right down to the bottom. Anchor it to the opening. Don't go all the way up to the top plate. It's got to anchor itself to the opening itself, and then down to the bottom plate. So this dialog box allows you to specify every piece of lumber that you're going to need every time you create an opening. Exactly how to frame it, so it'll appear in all of your working drawings, and it'll piece count them in your material reports as well. If you need additional members, so if you wanted a triple king stud or triple jack studs, just hit new or copy, and it creates a copy of them, and then you just show it its position. So if I wanted another jack stud, I would anchor it to the wall core itself, to the opening, or to one of the other jack studs that are already there. Okay, so this is how it's going to frame our openings. We know how to frame our walls. Now this is the table that it's going to use to frame our openings. You can see in this dialog box that I can remove any of these spans. So for those of you that know, every time I have an opening, as long as it's under 10 feet, I'm going to just use two 2x10s. But anything over that, I might step it up and use some timber strand product as an example. So you could remove that 3-foot span, or anything over that 10-foot span. You're not going to stop at 16. You're going to go right to 20. You could remove those spans. So these spans that we've specified here, you can add new ones or remove ones that are there, and point it to the exact product that you want to use for each of those spans as well. So you can customize how it's framing the wall and the members that it's using for framing that wall as well. Okay, so that's how it handles putting the openings in and how to frame those openings. It always follows the rules in our building locations dialog box. But what if you need a particular opening or a particular wall not to follow the rules? Maybe one wall you don't want to have the blocking, and on this particular opening you need to beef up that header size because of a point load coming down. You don't want to follow the rules. Well, that's when we go up to the View pull-down menu, and under the View pull-down menu we choose Framing Mode On/Off. This framing mode, you'll notice, kind of casts a color over all of our walls. They get that kind of orangey color, and our openings become a rose color. That allows us to pick on that particular framed wall by left-clicking on it, and when I right-click to reveal the options, I can look at the properties of how it's framed, just this one wall. So I'm looking at the properties of this wall on how it's framing it. And right now it's telling me it's referring to our building locations information. Whatever is programmed up there, 16 inches on center, double top plate, single bottom plate, row of blocking, follow that rule, frame this wall that way. If I want to frame it in an alternative way, I could say use a custom infill configuration. Don't follow the building location rules, custom frame it. And then I would select a custom framing. Brings me back into that exact same list. And in that list, now I'm going to tell it, just give me double top plate and double bottom plate. Don't put any blocking in this wall. Click OK and OK. And then it's framed that way. Majority of the reasons why you would frame a different wall, well, think of your garage walls where you might want to have a pressure-treated bottom plate. Or perhaps you don't use blocking at all, but there's a kitchen wall where you're going to be legging in some cabinetry. You're going to want some blocking there, so you're going to want to show that in the framing. So instead of following the main rules, those walls can have something different. Now let's look at this opening. Again, just like I left-click to select that wall and its framing information, I'm going to left-click and select that opening, and then right-click and look at its properties. What it's telling me is that this particular opening is referring itself to the infill and following the rules of our building locations information. But again, I can use a custom head sill configuration. And by clicking on this Select Configuration button, it'll take me into that list that we looked at of all of the various head sill and jamb configurations, where I can say on this opening, yes, let's use that timber strand product. I'll click that configuration and click OK. Now when I hit View Framing Mode On/Off, we can visually see that it's picking up and using that different product, and that wall doesn't have any blocking halfway up. So we've custom framed those walls. It's picking the lumber that we want to use to frame that particular wall. I'm going to go back up to View, Framing, Display all but the framing. And I'm going to put this down into a 2D view. So we talked about how it's framing that wall. When we look at a roof, I'm going to left-click to select the overhang of the roof, and then right-click to look at the properties of that roof. Let's look how it frames the roof itself. In the Roof dialog box, I'm going to click here on the Basic tab. At the very bottom of that tab, you see Specify Framing. In the Specify Framing dialog box that appears when I pick on that button, it's going to show me the rafters that it's going to use to frame that. You can specify, again, the member that you want to use as your rafter. This little button that appears, that little blue square, by picking on that, that allows you to choose something different than what's listed right here. So right now it's using a 2x8. By picking on that button, that takes you into the catalog. Same catalog where we saw those studs, exact same spot, but this time you pick a different member size that you want to use for your rafters. And then you specify the spacing. If we punch a hole in the roof, perhaps for a skylight or a dormer, it'll want to know how to handle that framing. Again, what member size are you going to be using for that? So again, we have that member where you can pick whatever size you want by picking on that button and then telling it that you want it to frame using that. Now, above all of those options, you can see that it has an option there for yes or no. Do I include this in the framing? Yes, it'll show the rafters. If it's set to no, you won't have any framing. It'll be completely blank. And that's the same for our openings. Do I want to include the 2x8 to frame out the openings? Yes, include it. No, don't. Then we don't see any additional framing around the openings itself. That's how you frame the roof itself. The floor. Now, new in version 10, we had the structural floor framing tool. And I find that to be a fantastic tool. I'm just going to click on our wall here just to make sure that I put in a structural floor here. I'm just going to check in here, and I'm going to delete out the floor that we have. So I'm just going to go into a camera inside the house to look at the floor that's there. And I'm just going to delete that out. So we have no floor, so I can show you how to frame the floor and put it back into 2D. I'm going to come up here and use our structural floor tool. This tool is available in Envisioneer Professional and Envisioneer Construction Suite. The other versions of our software don't have the framing capabilities, and they won't have the structural floor tool. So if you're using Pro Architect, this will be a tool that you don't have, because this is a custom framing tool. So to use the structural floor tool, I can insert the floor in 3 different ways. By perimeter, it'll look at the perimeter walls of my entire floor plan, and it'll put in one large floor surface within that perimeter. Structural floor by room will only put it in one particular room that you might want to frame. So again, if this is an addition and you're adding on, bumping out and adding on a room at the back of the house, that might be the tool that you want to use, just frame that room. Or we have structural floor by picking points. You can pick points to show all of the corners of where the rim joist is going to reside and custom put in those points. For today's example, we have just one room. It's the perimeter of our house, so I'm going to use structural floor by perimeter. When I do that, the catalog panel to the right will appear, and it'll show me the various options that I have. Each one of these structural floors has information behind it about what to choose for the joist, the rim, the sill plate even if you wanted to put it in at the same time, and also the subfloor. So I'm going to right-click here in the catalog and edit this element so you can look at the various settings that are part of this structural floor. So this structural floor, again, just like the other dialog boxes that I was showing you earlier in regards to the head sill and jam table and our infill configurations, the components are listed on the left. Their individual parameters will be in the middle, and it will highlight the member being used here on the right in our diagram. So the first component is just general properties. When it's looking at framing the floor, what's the direction of the joist? we see direction for 0 degrees is running left to right. That's 0 degrees. If it's running up and down on your floor plan, that's a 90-degree orientation. You can type in any joist direction there too. So if you have some odd framing configuration that's running the joist on 45s or something like that, or some odd degree, type in that angle and it will frame to that angle for you. But 0 is left to right, and up and down orientation for your floor joist is going to be a 90-degree direction. After it looks at the orientation of the floor joist, then it looks at the spacing. 16 inches on center. If it's going to be anything different, 12 inches on center, or maybe a larger span between your joists, you can type that direction in here. The next looks at joist at bearing. What that means is if I had a beam running right down the middle of our floor, when the joists come up to that and I stop the joist at that beam, do I want to stagger them? Meaning, do I want the joist on the other side to come past it as well and to stagger them like that? So I have an orientation looking like this. And how far are they overlapping? Well, that's that distance here. Or alternatively, when I have a beam in the middle running right down, the other option that we have here available is called hold back. And that allows you to stop the floor joist flush with that beam. So they're just going to stop just like that. They're not going to overlap. They're going to run themselves right through, but stop, and they'll be individual. This will be a member, and this will be a member. But they stop right along that beam. So if you were using joist hangers, this would be the choice that you would use. Okay? We're going to leave ours at stagger and 1 foot. So then we'll put in a beam later and show you how that works. Then I look at the sheathing in the list of components on the left, and it's telling me that I'm using 3/4 inch OSB. If I want to use a plywood or a zip panel or whatever material you want to use, that's what that little button's for again. It takes you back into the catalog where you can choose a different type of sheathing material, an alternative selection. It's going to be framed in the quantity list. It's going to be part of our floor system, and it's going to be called subfloor. Then it looks at the joist, and I'm just going to move this upwards here so you can see that it's highlighting our joists. So it's highlighting the selections in green as we choose them. So our joists are 2x10s. Again, that button appears so I can go back out to that member list like we did with the studs, like we did when we were looking at all the different members, and choose an alternative member. What's its orientation? Do I want it to be on the flat or do I want it to be up and down? The phase is more for quantity information, so when it goes and these joists appear in my material list, they're going to be part of the floor system group, and they're individually going to be labeled as floor joists. My sill plate, same thing, highlighted on the right-hand diagram, and in the middle, it's telling me that it's a 2x6 treated plate. I can go through, pick that button, pick a different size. So if I wanted a 2x8 sill plate or I wanted a 2x4 sill plate, I can choose those alternative sizes. My band joists, they highlight perpendicular to my joist. They're also 2x10s. I've labeled them as rim joists, so they appear in the list. My rim joists, again, running parallel to my floor joists, are the same product, 2x10. But they could be anything. So if you're using I-joists and you have strand board or anything else that you're using for your rim board, go through and choose those alternative materials. They're in the catalog. You can choose the ones that you want to use alternatively. If I cut a hole in my floor, maybe for a stairwell, how does it frame out that opening? Choose the member size that you want to use as the framing member, and it'll shoot one of them across each side of the opening for you. You can always double up later. I'll show you how to do that too. Okay? So these are all of the products, all of the lumber that it's going to order when we put in this floor. So if you want to change up the members that it's choosing when you're framing a floor, you come into this dialog box, pick different members, and then insert the floor. Okay? So I'm just going to hit cancel here. And with that floor chosen, I left click right inside. And right away, you can see the floor joists running through the building. They're all highlighted yellow there. I'm just going to turn off down at the bottom of my screen here, this view filter. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the roof just to make it a little bit easier so we can see those floor joists going through. Okay. I'm going to put a beam running right through our selection here. And then once I have that beam in, I'm going to show you how we can break the bearing of those joists to do our stagger like we wanted it to. Okay, so I've got a member chosen here. I'm going to put it down in our foundation location. I can still lightly ghosted see my floor joist, but I want to put in an advanced member. Again, this will be a tool for our Envisioneer professional and construction suite users. If you're using Pro Architect, you'll have the single member command. The difference will be is our advanced member tool will allow me to put in multiple members at the same time. You'll just have to put them in individually. So using advanced members, I tell it, first of all, is this going in nice and flush, or am I putting this on a slope? I'm going to be putting this on a zero slope. I want it to be a nice, level beam. But if I was using this for raked eaves trim, I could automatically put it in at any slope value I wanted to. Then I choose the member that I want to use, 2 by 10. See the little button that appears? Always think when you see that little button with the 3 dots, I can go back to the catalog and choose an alternative size. So I'll choose maybe a 2 by 12 and click OK. Now I'm specifying a 2 by 12. Now it wants to know how many. How many do I want to insert? I'm going to say 2. When I insert it, the reference point that I use, so if I'm elevating this up and down at all, is going to be the top end of that member. And when I insert it, I'm inserting it along its center point. But I could go to the left or the right side to insert it as well. Very handy. If I wanted to rotate it so it's flat, not sitting upright, I can do that. And I can also shift it from my orientation. So that's helpful when you want to put this member in, but you want it to be kind of shift over from a known corner. Then you can do that here. Below is the information of how it's going to quantify. So it's going to put it in the framing members group as part of my floor system. This offset value here allows you to offset it off the floor. So right now, I'm inserting this beam down in my foundation. It takes the top level of the beam to insert it. And it inserts it right now 0 inches off my foundation floor. So I want to tell it to go 8 feet off of my foundation floor, so it comes to the underside of those joists that are on my ground floor location. So I'm going to change this value here to be 8 feet. So I'm inserting 2 2 by 12, labeling them as a framing member in my floor system, and they're going to be 8 feet off the ground. I hit insert. I'm going to pick my center point of my wall. See my cursor? It's a circle with an X. If I slightly move it, see how it's not? That circle with an X tells me I'm in the right midpoint of that wall. That circle with an X always finds endpoints and midpoints. So right now I know I'm in the midpoint of that wall. I left click. I draw my cursor down to the opposite side and I left click again. I right click and I tell it that I'm finished inserting the members. So now I have, if I zoom in there nice and close, 2 2 by 12 inserted at the same time. Those 2 by 12s, if I double click on them, have that same purchase items tab. Bringing up its properties, you can see that I can order an 8-footer, 10, 12, 14, and 16. So depending on the length that I specified there and how long to go, so say I had it that it was 20 feet long. It knows I don't have a 20-foot board, so it can automatically optimize here and say you need 2 10-foot pieces. And it'll break it into 2 10-foot boards. And then I can put a column right smack dab in the middle, if that was the case. But I'm going to go up to the ground floor location again, down in the lower left-hand corner. I'm picking ground floor. And I want to tell it that these joists, I'm going to left-click on one of them, running entirely through my building, I want them to split themselves on that beam and overlap by a foot. Because remember, we had that stagger option. So I need to show it where that beam is. So I'm just going to select my structural floor by selecting the wall that's already there, and then holding down my shift key and moving my cursor. We have what we call cycle selecting. So I'm moving the wheel on my mouse and it cycles through all of the various things that are right where my cursor is that I could possibly select. So although my wall line and my floor line are overlapping, this cycle selecting allows me to pick the one that I want. So I cycle select through until I see these arrows. And these arrows let me know that I've selected the structural floor. What also lets me know that I've selected the structural floor is right down here on our prompt line. This is an important part of the software that you might not have looked at before, but this tells you, prompts you what to do in a command and what you've selected. So it's telling me that I've selected the structural floor. So now that I have it selected, I'm going to right-click, because remember, right-clicking always reveals options in the software. What I want to do is to tell it that I need to change something about this structural floor. I need to insert a bearing line. Insert a line to show it where that beam is underneath this floor. Insert a bearing line. When I do that, down in my prompt line, looking down the lower left-hand corner, it says pick the first insertion point. Where's the end of one of these beams? Left click right there. Now it says pick the next point. I'm going to go to the end of that beam. Left click again. And then it automatically puts those into two sections. And if I zoom in nice and close, because I know it's hard to see over the internet, especially because these are yellow, I might just right-click, select all of my joists, look at their properties. I'm going to change them all to black in appearance here. Sorry to do this so quickly, but it's not part of the lesson, and I just want to make sure that they appear. Let me select those again. Select all similar. Look at their properties, appearance, their 2D footprint. I want them to look black, so it's easier for you to see today. There's my floor joist. As soon as I put in that bearing line, it automatically split them right there and overlap them by a foot on either side. So now it's going to order that floor joist, looking at the properties of that member, right-clicking properties, and looking at that purchase items tab. So depending on the length of that joist, it'll go through the list of all available options to order a 10-foot piece, and it will order it. Remember, all of these lengths can have a rule. So this 24-foot piece, which is probably an expensive piece of lumber to order, you wouldn't want it to order it for your floor joist and cut it up, because it would be expensive. So you could tell it not to use it for this usage. Only use these other boards and cut them down as you need to. Okay? So that's how we order the lumber for walls, beams, the 2 2x12s, the floors, and the roof. Looking at the rules that we set in our building locations dialog box and the framing options there, and looking at the individual tools, the wall told me to order a 2x4. The floors told me 2x10s, 16 inches on center. The roof told me 2x8s and 16 inches on center. It grabs that lumber, the beams that it used, and it'll order those all accordingly. What I'd like to use the last portion of our class today for is to answer any specific questions that you might have about anything that I covered today. We did cover quite a bit of information, and the book that I'm sending you today will call out definitions and step-by-step instructions so you can step yourself through as well. And I am taping today's class so you can also review it again, watch it again to watch those steps that I picked. But any questions that you might have about the individual pieces of lumber that we picked today, or inserting the floor, or looking at the wall framing properties, type them into the GoToMeeting console that's on the right-hand side of your screen right now. You'll see a place to type in questions. They'll be sent directly to me. I'm the only one that can see them. So if you're a little bit shy about asking questions in a class, please don't be. I don't read out your name, and I really truly believe that every question is a great question. And if you're thinking it, everybody in the class is thinking it as well. So it's helpful for everyone. So let's look at the questions that have been posed there today. Scroll up. Oh, there aren't any. So that means that everybody thoroughly understood everything that I covered, or you completely didn't understand anything that I covered. So if you didn't understand anything, make sure you ask your questions. Oh, and I've got one in there right now. When you inserted the bearing beam, if you would have specified holdbacks on the floor joist, would you have to change the elevation of the beam? Yes, because right now I've got those joists sitting right on top of that beam. So if I wanted the beam to come up and be flush with the end of those floor joists, I would need to elevate them up, that beam up. So I'd go back down to my foundation location. I would select one of the 2x12. Then I would right-click and say Select All Similar. Very handy tool. Select every 2x12 that I've got in this floor currently. So if you've got a lot of different beams running on all and you realize you have to elevate all of them at the same time, this is a great way of selecting all of them. Select All Similar. Now both are selected. Then I would right-click and choose Elevate. That would allow me to move them up to be at the same flush location as my joist, and then I would use the hold back option for my joist. Great question. In using two 2x headers in a 2x4 wall, does Envisioneer automatically add a plywood filler to make it 3.5 inches, or would you have to do it? You would have to specify that you want a plywood filler. It doesn't want to assume anything in the software, so you need to specify it. So if I look again in 3D here at our model, and I'm going to go to Settings, Building Locations. On our ground floor, I'm going to look at our framing options, and I'm going to look at these span tables and say that for our span here, using the 2x10s here, let's look at our two 2x10s by clicking on that button. Double click. Right now, what it knows is that header number 1 is a 2x10. Header number 2 is a 2x10, and that's all the headers that it sees. So if I wanted to specify the plywood filler, I would need to copy that and create header number 3, or I could call it plywood filler. Okay, and then instead of being a 2x10 member, I could go and pick a plywood filler piece in here. Okay, so it never will assume anything. You always have to go through and tell it exactly what you want to choose, because what might be standard practice for you might be quite different for someone in the next county, in the next state. We ship around the world in 4 different languages, so you can imagine the different framing configurations that we come against in all different countries as well. So yes, you would have to specify and spell that out, that you want that plywood filler between the 2 pieces. Great question. Are pre-cut studs used for jacks, cripple, and all studs? Depends on how you have them specified. If you want your pre-cut studs to be used for all of them, your jacks and your kings and your cripples, when we're looking at the infill settings, building locations, framing configurations, the infill, what labels them the same here is the usage. When it goes to use that stick of lumber, it's called itself a stud. If I look at the, let me find one that's got a cripples and my jacks. So that's called a stud. Let's then look at our span table and look at the configurations we have there. Maybe this 2x8 one. When I look at the jack stud, it's labeled as a jack stud. So when I'm looking at the 2x4 wall, remember it said that the 92 5/8 piece could only be used by studs. If its usage was set to stud, use it. But if it's not, don't use it. So this being called a jack stud is an entirely different usage. So it couldn't use the 92 5/8. If I wanted it to, I would have to change this usage to be just a stud so that it could use that particular usage. So I just pick it to stud. Now my jacks can use those pre-cut lengths. And that's the same for my kings. My kings have been called a stud. They're going to use the same pieces as my studs. If I didn't want them to, if I wanted these to be entirely different framing members, give them a different usage, and it can allow it to call out different member sizes. Okay? So these are called studs. So if I look at my usages of a 2x4, let me go back in and look at a 2x4 in my member catalog here. So I'm just going to look at members, my 2x4. just to bring that all together now, the 92 5/8 can only be used by a stud. So if the framing configuration that you're using for your openings or your framing configuration on the wall calls it something other than a stud, it won't use that pre-cut piece. But if you add jack stud to this list, it could be used for a jack stud too. Use it for studs and use it for jacks. Or you could call your jack studs in your framing configuration simply a stud. So it will call up those same pieces as well. Another great question. And that seems to be all the questions. Let me just make sure, I'm going to go through the list to make sure there's nothing else there that I might have missed. That seems to be it. So I'm going to hold the line for one further minute. So if there's any questions that you can think about before we end off the class, you can ask them. Following the class again, just a reminder, I am sending you out an email that's going to include a booklet that covers all of this information. So you can step yourself through all of these various options, play around with it, draw a simple box. I always find it when you're first learning a new tool, keep the model simple. Because then you can focus in on the commands and the options that are there, and not how you can change all of the configurations for all of the different wall settings that you have in there in different directions that you might have them going. Let me just... Are sill plates automatically positioned at the bottom of a joist? That's part of that structural floor tool. And that structural floor tool, if I double click on one of the configurations here, you can see that it has the sill plate specified, and it's automatically going to put it at the bottom of those floor joists for you. If you didn't want it, then in the catalog panel here to the right, you can right click and say, I want to add a new configuration of how to frame a floor. And I'm going to say, this is without sill. Okay, at the top, I'm just changing that name. And then I'm going to come here to sill plate, and I'm going to say delete. There is no sill plate associated to it at all. So on my second floor as an example. I click OK. Now in my catalog, I have one without a sill plate and one that has one. Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining me for today's class. I hope you learned a little bit about how the software looks at framing the various elements and how it picks those individual pieces of lumber to use. Following up, read the booklet that I'm going to send you and watch the video again if you have any questions. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to call into our Technical Support Center. They're there to help you and answer any questions as they arise. So if you're stuck on something, call them right away. They'll have the answer and they'll get you going quickly and efficiently. Thanks again, everyone, for joining me for today's class. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.